Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Tobin Travarthen. He's the founder of Spatial Shift by Tobin, which is a strategic narrative design firm that specializes in designing breakout narratives for companies, executives, and movements. Hi, Tobin, and welcome to Kick and Snare.
All right. Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you. We met, I think, at least a few years ago now. It's been a while. And each time we've spoken, I really enjoyed the conversations and always left our talks feeling a little bit smarter afterwards. So, yes, I say that to be, intentionally flattering, but it's true also. Really have always enjoyed the conversations and felt like I came away with something meaningful. So, it's really an honor to do this with you, and I appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, and the feeling is mutual. Actually, I think when we first met, you were working for an internet company that had the word smart in it. Is that
It's
correct?
true. It was Smart Ad Server at the time,
There you go. All
and
right.
we subsequently rebranded it as Equative, and that was a really fun project for me. But we'll save that for a different conversation,
Yeah,
perhaps, or
to talk
later in this one.
the
So
beer.
yeah, but it wasn't a great name, and everybody knew it, and we lived with it for a long time. We debated whether or not it was working for us, especially with the word ad server when the market had already been largely captured by DoubleClick and Google. So the name was not working, and we knew it. We finally abandoned it, and I think improved quite a bit on it. I'm eager to jump into Spatial Shift. I'm interested to hear more about the practice, what you mean by narrative design, and things like that. So that's where I'd like to start off. So why don't you give us the top line, and then I'll hopefully still have some questions to ask afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's been an interesting journey. My background was very much sales and business development, for large corporations,
Sure.
and then jumping into startups, uh, you know, through the journeys on 5 startups. And in 2014, one of the companies that I took on was a PR firm who wanted to deal with the notion of earned media going away and like how are they going to survive? Because content had changed, journalists were going away. Uh, there was a lot of transition, and the social media really was on the rise at that point.
Sure.
Facebook was kind of shifting everything. So this notion, how do we deal with earned media? Influencers weren't really a thing yet. The idea of influencing others is very earned media oriented. And so we leaned into a John Hagel book that came out. And ironically, I've done 2 startups with John Hagel books. So it's kind of, he and I have a special relationship.
Mm,
Um, and the book was called The Power of Pull. And the whole idea was around this notion of narrative being in higher order than branding. And branding should fall out of narrative, right? So narrative is very much a pull kind of structure. It's meant to be a higher order. It's meant to have a call to action, where branding can get very, specific and narrow in its scope. So one thing led to another, and we invented this thing called agile narrative, which basically took on this construct of building and designing a narrative that would help a company to reorient itself to be more of a pull strategy than a push strategy.
got it.
And so, yeah, narrative design evolved out of that. And along the way, I was working with another company called Factory, and we were designing these immersive sprints with global 100 companies to solve big, hairy problems in 48 hours. So it was like it borrowed from Google's rapid product prototyping. In fact, one of
Right.
the co-founders of it came from Google. And so I'm sitting here looking at this like narrative challenge or branding or earned media challenge. And I'm looking at like, agile development over here that's kind of tech oriented. I'm like, well, I think we should just jam those together. And hence that's kind of how this narrative design process was born.
Got it.
It's a very collaborative, collective, super intense way to help a company find out who it is. Do you actually do what you say you do? And are you all in alignment? So that's the essence of what I've created.
Understood. That's interesting. I'm curious about the notion of, or the definition really might be a better way to say it. Between, there's a distinction between story and storytelling and narrative and narrative creation. Do you mind jumping into that a little bit? How do they differ?
Yeah. I kind of go back to Hegel, right? He defines story as something that had a beginning, middle, and end.
Right.
And it's a one way from me to you. Actually,
Hmm.
when you go to a movie or you read a book, it's a story aimed at you, and then you either agree or disagree with it. So it's very structured in terms of from me to you, one dimensional, my views to you, where narrative in its construct is much more give and take. I'm throwing out a concept. I'm asking for your input to it.
Hmm.
So we coexist with it, and we take it forward together in a dialogue kind of fashion. So net,
Understood.
it's more dialogue based than it is one way based.
Right. It sounds like you're inviting the participant. That's it. In essence, you're inviting the person to participate and go along for the ride, not observe it as a third party. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's a fine line, kind of nuanced. It could get a little academic on some level, but
Right.
I have found over time that invoking and inviting people into this discussion and dialogue with you has proven to be much more powerful than I am this, and thou will
Right.
like me.
Got it. Well, it's interesting. Sometimes company stories, or what somebody might consider a brand story or a narrative, and I don't want to pick apart everybody else's nomenclature too much or their vocabulary.
Yeah.
Um, that often it is a self-contained thing, where I would think narratives tend to, like any really good story, connect ultimately to things that are happening out there in the world, greater concepts. You could talk about an ad tech company delivering ads, or you could talk about greater macro trends within advertising and how, or in media consumption, and how the product aligns with these things happening externally at a bigger level. That seems more compelling and more bulletproof over the long term, in terms of like having a strategy that can evolve and with the market and be relevant all the way through.
I had a thing happen this morning. Actually, it happened over the last couple of days, but um, I've had these two dialogues with different people, one in, Scotland and one in my buddy in New York. And,
Right.
and I've been in and out of AI pretty extensively, and
Mm.
over the last 48 hours, really extensively. And the idea of perplexity meets Google, right? So I had a friend who just turned 65, and I typed into perplexity. It would be like, who is Michael Nevins and what is he known for? Right. And so perplexity,
Please don't do that. Please don't do
it,
that.
oh, it was amazing. It came back. And it basically described, who you were. Right. And if you did that on Google, you would just get a bunch of blue links
Sure.
that would link to all your stuff. Right.
Hmm.
Where perplexity took that stuff, gave it context, and then sourced it. So if you wanted to, you could go back and click into it, right? So I proceeded to do that for a couple people. And in my narrative work, I would refer to that as prevailing narrative. Like, well, so what is your narrative right now? Right? Or
Right.
what do you think it is? Right. And I have an assessment that takes you through all that from an executive perspective.
Hmm.
And on the corporate side, you do the same thing, right? You go out and interview and whatnot. But I just thought that was fascinating because just the shift of how Perplexity is doing this, and even ChatGPT search versus how Google used to do it, like we're in yet another cataclysmic
That's
shift,
interesting.
right?
Yeah.
So for all or the branding work that you've done that was keyword based and pattern based, it's almost like if you hadn't really developed your content to be more story rich, you're not show up in this new world
Right.
properly.
Right. I remember early, I also have the early part of my career, part of it was spent in sales. And while I learned all the crazy you know, Zig Ziglar type of, manipulative sales techniques and things like that because they were still in vogue in those days. And
Yeah.
go too far back. There's a lot of that manipulative sales technique going on, getting people to say yes and get agreement and this and that. But as time went on and I learned more about marketing, I started to work more in stories, to tell somebody a story, or I don't want to necessarily claim narrative, but the idea of talking in case studies and that kind of thing about how people took advantage of value of a certain product or service or whatever always felt much more credible, less manipulative, and somehow more valuable and effective, ultimately better way to operate. um I'm reminded of there was a time when I'd been consulting for a while and I was excited. I had an opportunity with a company. I won't mention the company because I don't want somebody to be able to decode who I'm talking about. Um, it's a good company. They're still around. This person isn't there anymore. Neither am I. But I had been spending time active in social media and other places in the category of this company. And when I got to the meeting, I had been brought in by originally another senior exec at the company, and then I'm meeting the CEO, and the CEO wanted to, wanted to bring me on, and he was excited about it. And then they thought, all right, well, who's going to sponsor this person in this new role that never existed before? We need an exec to do it. And the person who was chosen, drafted, I should say, against his will, probably, then needed to interview me. So he wasn't exactly friendly on my way in. And he said to me, so I've spent some time on Google, and this is just as we got started. So sit down, good to meet you. So I spent some time on Google, and let's just say I'm aware of your public brand.
Hmm.
So now let's talk about X, Y, and Z. And honestly, I was a little put off by it. Ultimately, I did get the job, and it was a good experience and everything else. But I remember being a little put off by the fact that I didn't get any chance to tell the story myself,
Yeah, right.
because he was skipping ahead saying, let's fast forward to what you're going to do for us or what I need to know, as opposed to tell me about yourself. And it was the first time I became acutely aware of how important that stuff was out there in the marketplace and in the world at large. And this is going back to, well, let me not say the exact year, more than 10 years ago. I'll put it that way. Again, I don't
Yeah.
want people extrapolating who this conversation was with, but it was interesting. And while it was off-putting, it really more effectively served to remind me that those little bits and pieces, those pointers out there, bits of information, keywords, whatever they are, that exist out there in the marketplace are important. And I like the idea that there are now tools that can stitch together a little bit more of a story rather than just whatever happened to fool Google's algorithm at any given moment,
Right.
lack of a better choice of words.
And what's fascinating is there's this whole debate about personal branding and the term personal branding versus, and I literally, I just read today, a colleague in the industry who is a brand strategist, like, abhors that term. And I do too. It's like, no, it's more than that.
Sure.
That just seems too promotional. So,
Yeah, I think a lot of
um,
people bristle at the phrase, and it feels self-important, and it feels
yeah,
just too superficial, I guess.
right. So it's interesting that you had that observation, because I think we're conditioned now to go Google someone before you have a conversation with them, right?
Indeed.
And I think going forward, we're going to perplexity someone or chat GPT someone, just
Right.
because it's a richer grab. Um, and it's fascinating because I've always told executives that, when we create this narrative, we're designing pattern language. So machines can pick you up as much as the humans. So we're basically writing for a machine and a human when we create a new narrative.
Yeah,
And
it's interesting.
it's starting to come back in volume now. So my curiosity is racing ahead. Like, okay, how do I pull in AI? How do I leverage AI? Um, and that's kind of what has fueled this whole concept called narrative mosaic. I'm kind of pressing on. Um, I'm
Tell
in
us more about
over
that.
my yeah, I'm
Yeah,
in way over my skis.
that's okay.
The deeper
That's
I
where
get
we
in,
innovate, right? Come on.
right? Yeah, the deeper I get into AI, the more I'm kind of like, oh, I'm actually creating this, and um, And it's ironic because it goes all the way back to a concept I came up with in 2007. So you and I, share a son on the spectrum. And so having a Spencer who's now 32, I was always curious, well, how does his brain work? It's like, how do we get through to him? Or if he's having a moment, like, how do we shift him? And that's when I ran into the book, Your Brain on Music. And that,
Right.
lo and behold, he was a very musical kind of guy. And,
Mhm.
we could shift his moments through music. And it was like, wow, that was pretty powerful. And then I kind of kept stewing on this idea, and it kind of came back to this idea, which is why Spatial Shift was born as a concept, um, was how do we learn? We all learn different. We have visual
Sure.
learners, audio learners, rote learners. And I'm like, wouldn't it be really cool to go fetch that data and pull it back in the way that we best learn?
Mhm.
And in '07, that was AOL land. It was like the tech wasn't there. I didn't know what this was. I didn't know it was a browser, a plugin. I think those terms existed. Browser was yes, but plugin
Yeah.
no. So I I kind of had this concept, and I remember talking to this guy who led our advanced products at Netscape, and he's like finishing my sentences, and he's like, "I can build this," and I'm like, "Whoa."
That's
Okay.
exciting.
And at that point, it was going to be 3 million, 5 million. It needed some girth because just we weren't there yet
Right.
technologically, right? And so you fast forward, I guess I've been nibbling at this thing for 17 years in different ways and constructs and whatnot. And, all of a sudden I'm messing around uh, with the notion of, I've always viewed what we do, or I guess what I do, is building a mosaic.
Mhm.
Um, you've got this Tesla, like you just explained your Google experience, right? We have this digital Tesla that's everywhere. You could call it digital exhaust, whatever the
Right.
term is today,
Right.
term du jour. But if you put it into a mosaic context, mosaics were built with Tesla, was whatever the material was that was around at the time,
I see.
pottery, uh, pieces of stone, glass, etc. And so I kind of view like what we are made up of is all this digital Tesla that's everywhere and nowhere, right? Because it's scattered. And then who is the real Michael? Is it the artist Michael, the dad Michael, the business Michael, the friend Michael? Like
Mm.
we have all these different personas. And I think the pandemic kind of set all those free because you became this person behind the screen and you got to
Yeah.
see
The view
everything,
into
right?
everybody's home and all that. Yeah.
And so the digital, the narrative mosaic kind of was born as this like, well, could could we represent the whole person in a way that brings all these dimensions of Michael alive? And so I started dabbling with AI, did Chat GPT meets Dolly, created a GPT. That kind of didn't work. Couldn't get the likeness to work. And then I was on Mid Journey, and it would put a version of Michael together, but it wasn't Michael. So again, I was
Sure.
back to likeness. And I was learning the differences of people being able to see themselves. If it didn't look like you couldn't go there.
Right. Right. It's hard
And
to
then I
relate to
ran
it. Yeah.
into the biases because, heaven forbid you're a person of color. Like it just couldn't get that right.
Yeah.
I'd have to really manipulate it to like make it representative. And then somehow I tripped into these guys. They found me, I found them. I don't remember how, but um, it's a couple guys that were in the gaming industry. They worked at Riot Games. They had created this engine called Distillery, which was another layer above the whole LLM world. And
Mhm.
now I understand where it fits. Um, but I was able to give them my image and then narrative construct or content. And they built an engine for me that mapped that together so that I could now create like a mosaic of a person who would represent more of a multidimensional way
Okay.
to express yourself. And we came up with like I think, 40 different art styles, if you will, that would mimic kind of how they do game narrative, where you got character development and stuff.
Mhm.
So it's kind of coming together in a roundabout way. It's going all the way back to my original spatial shift construct. And then when I was at TED AI last week, or a couple weeks back, this whole agent movement that's happening, and Salesforce just launched Agent Force, and you've got all these agents who are going to be our digital twin or representation of us. I'm like, holy shit, the whole concept is now
Mhm.
here. It
Yeah,
has a different name, but that's exciting, and
that is
terrifying.
exciting. So I've seen some of these mosaics, and I've seen a couple that you've done, and even for some
we,
people that
we
we
need to
know
do
in
you.
common.
Yeah, we need to do you.
Yeah, tell me about what's in it. So I see the face represented, and I'll find a way to share one along with the podcast when it's
Okay.
published. But describe for us, there's a face in the center, and then there's mosaic pieces, extending outward to the edges of the page, so to speak. And forgive me if I'm getting
Yeah, yeah.
the
No.
names wrong. What's in it? Help us understand those pieces.
Yeah. So,
And I want to hear you say the word again, because I was not this piece of a mosaic was not a word that I was familiar with.
oh, Tessera.
Tessera, thank you.
Yeah, that is an ancient term that goes back to, the Greek days.
Right.
And, this all kind of came together because I went to Ravenna, Italy, and I
Hmm.
studied with a master mosaicist, because I really wanted to get into I wanted to take the metaphor of what I was doing and get my hands dirty and
Sure.
literally build a mosaic. I have a couple really ugly mosaics that I created, but I
That's
did
okay.
it.
That's okay.
And there I learned about portraitures, right? So there's mosaics are very well known for their portraiture approach. Um, so effectively, what this is trying to create is a modern portraiture, if you will.
Okay.
So I take your image. So I ask for a high res photo of you, headshot, let's call it,
Hmm.
and then I'm working on a form that's going to pull out stuff from you. But when you work with me, I get to know you pretty deep. So I understand pieces that made you you. And when I have an executive that I work with, I'm pulling that knowledge in and I'm feeding that into the prompt, if you will. And the prompt, I can, like I have 40 of these things, right? So I can really start to lean into your, musicianship, or I could
Hmm.
lean into your chef, or I could lean into all these other things that make you you. And then you basically have the idea of foreground, background. So I can dial up the likeness or the artsiness. So I'm finding, and this is a very generalist statement, but it now with 40 data points, it's kind of becoming a pattern.
Sure.
Women can see themselves in these outputs, and then they tell stories about it. It's fascinating. Men look for themselves. That's a subtle distinction, but like
Hmm.
most of the men who I do this for will go, "Gosh, that doesn't look like me," or "That doesn't really represent me." And I'm like, "Well, actually, it does."
Right.
And it's not meant to be a photograph of you. It's meant to be an interpretation of you
Hmm.
uh, in this, uh, with all these attributes and variables that
Right.
feed in. Um,
That's interesting. Do you think that
so
the men have a harder time getting out of the way of their own sort of self-perception, ego, that kind of thing? That I don't want to generalize too much.
yeah,
It's dangerous to
right.
generalize too much about men versus
I
women, but I'm
yeah, I don't
curious.
know the answer to it. I'm just
Yeah.
fascinated with the data points, right?
Sure.
And so I'm kind of digging into the whys of that. Um, and so now I'm more curious, like, well, why is that? Why do we behave like that? Is
Yeah,
it a
yeah.
gender thing? Is that like just a where we are in time thing? Like, I don't know. Uh,
Right. I'm sure there's some interesting research on, men overestimating their good looks versus women underestimating their looks. And I've read these types of things before. I
all
wonder where
right.
those things might be playing a role here.
Yeah, I'm definitely into behavior sciences and neuroscience, like plowing into all these things,
It's very cool.
try to understand what's happening.
So it's interesting to me, because I know a little bit about you, and I don't want to give away all the things that I know about you from our previous conversations, but so you have this very strong now visual arts thing integrated into what you're doing. And of course your history and marketing and sales and branding and spatial shift and otherwise is largely words based. But I also know that you have a background as a DJ,
Yes.
and that's fascinating to me. So, we're kindred spirits in that I've never been a DJ. I sure as hell like to play music for people and turn them on to it. And I like
I'm probably a
making music, of
DJ because
course.
I can't play music.
Well, it's there's hey, turn people onto a song that they love, and they'll remember it forever. So it's a beautiful thing. Certainly, nobody's ever said that about my drumming, or any of the songs I've written. So, tell me more about your the history as a DJ, how you got into it, and how is it something you're still doing, and like where does music play a role, and audio, if you will, in some of the things.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny. I think, when I was in elementary, mid, yeah, middle school, let's call it. I actually played the cornet at the time. There was not a
Mhm.
trumpet. Um, and then I had my teeth knocked out, my front teeth,
Oh
and
no,
that ended my Winston Marsalis career because like I couldn't deal with the pressure against my teeth at the time.
sure,
So that I think that had a large impact on my ability to play music. Um, I think growing up in Flint, Michigan, was very in tune with Motown. I had an older brother, 10 years older than me. He was very into like Led Zeppelin and rock. So
right,
Beatles, Steppenwolf, Rare Earth. I mean, like I grew up with his music, and then I had my music, and then we had an uncle who probably had 1,045s. He was like a total 45 junkie,
love
and we
that.
were down in the basement. We would just play his records. So I guess growing up, I had that kind of influence, and then when I got to college, um, I started. I think I went to a couple nightclubs or whatever, and it was like, oh, I could do that. That's kind of cool. So I bought turntables, I bought equipment, and I just practiced forever to beat mix and blend.
Right.
And then I convinced a nightclub to give me a shot, and I did it. And then that was a 10-year journey. And
Fantastic.
I got really good at beat mixing. I got in DJ pools out of London, so I was getting new music. Like
Mhm.
I broke Culture Club 6 months before it hit the airwaves, so I was always like 6 months ahead of what showed up on radio.
Right. I completely forgot about record pools as a thing back in the day. I
Yeah,
imagine they still are in some fashion, but I'm not tuned in enough to know.
yeah. Today, I'm sure they would just be dubs and overdubs and beat mixes and stuff. In
Mhm.
fact, last night, in prep for today, I watched the Joni Mitchell documentary on Prime.
I haven't seen it yet, but go on.
She is an innovator. Like she was thing all the way. I mean, she's still going at 81.
Sure.
I didn't realize the kind of innovation that she brought to music. And then the other one was Steely Dan, Asia, how they made that album.
I
And
I know that documentary well.
right, I mean that, and I took that documentary and I was like, it's kind of how work works today, right? Like a distributed workforce.
Hmm.
Like they were so reliant on studio musicians, and then they wrote the music in a way where they could find the right musician to amplify their talents to make the outcome the way they wanted. I didn't really know that going into this documentary. And I was like, man, that is such a powerful, different way to make music. I mean,
Yeah,
Toto was also one of those too, but
sure.
so,
So does DJing play a role, or your history doing it? I mean, what did you learn from it? Did it, I mean, obviously, beat mixing and keeping a crowd moving and things like that is definitely a skill and an art form,
yeah.
and otherwise. Uh, how does it inform what you're doing today, if at all? I'm sort of curious about
Oh,
how it plays out in what you do.
I think a lot. Um, I think if you think about story, in general, music is a universal language, right? So, I mean, uh, it is one of the most powerful communication tools we have. So, on some level, the genres of music that you grow up with or respect or go see, shape who we are. They're triggers. In fact, something just happened, in Wales with a group of people I didn't know. They throw on Michael Jackson and the whole room explodes, and you're like, okay, um, case in point. And I think the other thing that really, and I just wrote about this a while back, um, I learned how to facilitate because of that, right?
Mm,
Because I could judge the vibe and the mood of the room, and then I had the power to shift it, you know? I could make people go crazy. I could make people go romantic. I could
right,
clear the
right.
floor, you know? I could bring the floor back. I mean, like I could do all sorts of things just through the power of beats and music and who I put on and how I
Got it.
segued, you know?
Makes sense.
Um, and I think that uh has fueled and fed my capability or capacity, if you will, to lead workshops, um, pull different kinds of people together in a room, and pull out the answers. Because I always say the answer is always in the room. It just never had a voice.
Mm,
And I swear when I do these sessions with companies, it is always the most quiet person who's been working on this thing, problem for like 2 years, but like no one's paying attention or won't listen. And then they say something, and then the CEO's like, "That's it. Why didn't we know that?" And it's like, well, it was always there. I think you
right.
just stepped
Right.
over it.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I could see when you develop a sensitivity for, um, keeping a room moving, dancing, whatever it is, that, how that could play out really nicely when you're facilitating, because there's a certain rhythm to it, or lack of rhythm when it's,
Yes.
I've certainly been in meetings, even with small teams, where it's not a formalized thing, like a spatial shift session. Suggest you're overly formal, but that's a planned, executed thing. In an average meeting, though, there are times when people are quiet. The dynamics sometimes keep people from contributing well. And when it starts to move, when you start to see people contribute and feel comfortable, safe, to do it, there's a certain momentum to that. I think that a leader feels, and certainly the group around the leader should feel that as well. It's not always easy to get there. And it's certainly not something you want to squash once it gets going. You
Yeah.
don't want
Right.
people sitting on the sidelines anymore. So it's an interesting thing to think about. So I think it would be a good idea to shift gears, because I'm looking at how much time we have, and I realize I should have booked much more time with you, and we're gonna have to do this again. But there's some other things that I want to cover. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to shift gears just a
Yeah.
little bit.
Please.
If anybody hasn't already, they'll look at your LinkedIn profile, and it goes on for days, because look, your resume is spectacular, but it's also sort it would be a gross understatement to say that you've had an eclectic career.
Yes.
Your experience includes everything from traditional media to audio stuff to ad tech to social media, the wine business, and then a variety of consulting and advisory board experience. I mean, you may actually be the world's most interesting man. I think you might
I have
actually
a
be
lot of
that
stuff
guy.
up.
Clearly, we can't do your whole um, resume and personal history and background, but you have, and I also have sort of an eclectic background, not as broad as yours, and certainly not as extensive, but at the same time, I'm fascinated by how your background may have led you to where you are today. And I know in the past we've talked about connecting dots, and that may have come up today already. How does this play out for you? Was there a logical thread in how you got here? What was your narrative getting here, as opposed to how would you encapsulate it today? Is
Yeah.
that a fair way to ask the question?
Yeah, I think my strength and my weakness is, one and the same, because I am not logical. Um, and I've tried to be logical. I think, the one thing that kind of shaped my early career um, was being involved at Gannett is where it kind of started. It was somewhere around the late 80s, maybe, yeah, 89, 90, 91, somewhere in there.
Right. So it was a print business in those days, largely,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
But um, while I was growing up in the print business, this notion of corporate sales came to be, right?
Hmm.
There was a movement in the media side to represent and sell all the assets of the company as a
Sure.
solution, as opposed to, like, buy a page or buy a dot or buy a
Mhm.
spot, right? Um, and I got involved in the earliest stage of Network, which was pulling together all of our assets. And because I was at USA Weekend at the time, we had to be really innovative to sell that thing, because it was a Sunday supplement. Uh, so there was a lot of advanced innovation things that we were trying to do, but we had to be like that in order to get on the schedule, right? Because it was typically not a place you would hang out as a brand. So I think having to be creative to overcome obstacles, and then now be put into a place where it's like, okay, here's the whole toy box. Um, And I remember going to Gatorade at the time, because, we had all the fantasy sports stuff. We had USA Today, we had TV stations, outdoor boards. So we were literally able to kind of merge the notion of sports marketing, with outdoor boards and TV that would
Right.
tie Gatorade to Kroger or Albertsons or whatever, right? And so I was enamored with that, because it was like, oh my God, it really is coming down to, like, inventing something from nothing. Like, here's all the pieces.
Right.
How do you put those together to make
That was your first mosaic.
it work? Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. In retrospect. And then from there, there was a lot of holes. It was very Swiss cheesy at the time.
Mhm.
Um, And then I got hired to go to Meredith, who at the time, Meredith was probably the lead player in this whole concept, because, their assets came together very nicely.
Right.
Cookbooks and SIPs and, uh, direct response. We had the largest, 60 million coupon thing. So I was
Right.
literally able to work with a lot of CPG companies. In fact, I was in the kitchens at Kraft. I had the Better Homes and Gardens kitchen meets the Kraft kitchen, and we were inventing new cream cheese solutions. And what could we do with low fat versus no fat versus regular?
Right.
So that got me into innovation, because we were mashing things together that didn't go together before.
I love that you're talking about cream cheese solutions and mashing things together at the same time. This is clearly the only podcast I can think of where that is happening at this very moment, at least.
And then, again, so with Meredith, I was doing really cool stuff. And then I'm like, God, I need a bigger toy box. And then the whole notion of Time Inc. and Time Warner kind of came up.
It's true.
And
There
at that
was
time,
integration going on at the bigger companies. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And at that time, we had our first son. We were living in Chicago. My wife's from Los Angeles. We didn't have any family support. So
Mhm.
there was an opportunity to move back to Los Angeles with Time Warner, or Time Inc. at the time.
Yep.
So I was able to kind of take on the dream job and get back to, family structure support. And then if you think about, at that point, Time Inc. then merged with Warner, then merged with Turner. So we had, like, the world's largest media company,
Right.
sans AOL, which came later.
Mhm.
Um, So I was playing, on a big stage, big money with big assets, and it was really cool.
That's
So,
cool.
but I was horizontal, uh, inside a very verticalized company. Every P&L was vertical, and I was trying to raise the boats for the whole company.
Sure.
But I was in conflict with the P&L owners, because I, had to manipulate discounts and move things around for the
Right.
good of the whole.
I can imagine that. Yeah.
Um, so that's a book unto itself. But
Yeah. I
so
could
to answer your
I could
question,
relate to that piece having worked at an agency holding company. Uh, who's getting the credit for the revenue at the end of the day. Yeah.
well, and I actually have an example on that specific thing, working with Quaker across multiple agencies, and became a nightmare.
Right.
Um, but to back up and answer your question specifically, I kind of have been a generalist and I've been a horizontalist, in a
Right.
very vertical world. So I just, my brain works that way.
Right. Well, you're also curious and creative, and that generally means that you're interested in novelty.
Yeah.
And uh, I know that's true for me. Like, once I've learned something, I'm interested in what else can I learn. It's not always a vertical path; it's sometimes a horizontal path.
Yep.
Um, it's hard to know where you're going to go at any given time if you're generally curious and interested in trying new things. So, on the point of creativity, almost every conversation we've had has touched on either creativity in business or in personal pursuits and otherwise. And I'd like to go a little further on that.
Sure.
Should everybody be creative? I'm curious about your thoughts on, being deliberate about being creative, the process of being creative, the habits around being creative. While you may not yet be the world's greatest mosaic artist, and visual artist or whatever, and I will
Yep.
certainly never be a great musician or great music artist. There's a certain value in living in that every day and in that headspace in the actual act. And I wonder if you'd share your thoughts on that.
Yeah. In fact, it's funny. A friend of mine, that I just recently met along the way, is kind of reimagining herself, as the leader of fun, like bringing fun back. And she's a very, boisterous, outgoing person who was a child star and then became a lawyer, and then, got into like content and copywriting. And she kind of
Interesting.
rediscovered her youth, right? And is now exuding that as a 50 something, and saying we've lost fun, right?
Mm,
And it prompted me to tell her about this book, called The Orbiting Giant Hairball, who was written by a guy named Gordon McKenzie. His
okay.
title was Director of Creative Paradox at Hallmark. So when you go into
That's the best
Hallmark,
title ever.
oh my God, he was an amazing guy. He was a recovering alcoholic, had a ponytail, just a creative, right? And
Right.
his job, when you went into Hallmark, it was a T. To the right were the creatives, to the left were the suits. And his job was to get the suits and the creatives to work together. And so he had a
Okay.
presentation, um, that basically became the book. Um, and in his presentation, he would always talk about, like, he would go into a class in kindergarten and go, who wants to be an artist? And like everyone's hand would go up, right? And he
Hmm.
would do that every class, first grade, second grade, third grade. He goes, by about sixth grade, it's kind of like, and then by the time they got to high school, it was like, yeah, you know. So it's like the education system just quashed out the notion of creativity. So we would be conformed
Yeah.
to more of a box, right? And that presentation and that whole experience just never left me. And to answer your question, yes, I think we all are creative in our own way. And I think, unfortunately, education and societal crushes us out of that.
Mm.
And I remember coming out of college, I was a nightclub DJ. So I was like, oh, I want to go into radio programming. Like I want to program the music, right? And so I met with all these radio stations and, had a couple people go, dude, you don't want to be in radio. You don't want to be in programming. You can't make any money doing that. You need
Mm,
to go into sales. That's where you make all the money, right?
right.
And, being poor and eating ramen and all this shit you do post college, it was like,
Yes.
yeah, I can go for some money.
Yeah.
And I, you know, made the decision to go sales. And, do I have regrets? I don't know. Like who would I have become had I gone my programming route was my original
Right.
gut intention, right?
Makes sense. When you lead your engagements, particularly the spatial shift stuff that you do, you spoke to a 48-hour process. And so it makes me think about the good and the bad of deadlines. As somebody who struggles sometimes with attention issues myself, deadlines are important to keeping me accountable and making things happen, right? So I'm curious about your thoughts on the effect of deadlines. When it's good to be messy and creative and those types of things. We understand that it's important to success of a company, strategy, thinking, et cetera. But it's hard to quantify the value of it. It's hard to know how long to work on things. It's for me as somebody who's had to lead creative projects and manage creative people and feeling akin to the creative process. It's always been challenging to know how to best manage it for the best results. And at what point do you let people spin for a while? And when do you say, okay, pick two or pick three, as we used to do in the agency world, one that we really liked, one that we could live with if we didn't like it, and a third one that was the throwaway example, the throwaway version. How do you think about this type of stuff
Oh
in your
my God.
practice and outside it?
Yeah, that's a tension. Um, uh, Deadlines are guardrails, right? Because without
Mhm.
them, we wouldn't stop. Um, I look at my two projects that I just com- I completed one and I'm about to complete the other, and it's 6 weeks beyond like the deadline, and there was all sorts of circumstances in there. But
Sure.
yeah, at some point it was like, okay, 3 iterations, that's it. Like we got to stop at three. And I think this whole agile thing that I learned with the 48-hour effort um, is, it kind of goes back to Seth Godin, just ship it, get it out there,
Yeah.
and then iterate. Right.
That's true.
So I kind of really have adopted that school, being just get it out there, iterate. It is a perpetual beta is kind of how I think now. Um, Especially today, everything's changing so fast. In fact,
Yeah.
at TED AI, the thing that kind of hit me in the forehead was when the guy from OpenAI got up and talked, and he was like, he talked about Chat GPT-4 being elite. And Chat GPT 3.5 got some mixed reviews. The shift between 3.5 and 4.0 was 4 months, right?
Like
And
no
that
time
made
at all. Yeah.
3.5 obsolete. Like you couldn't build anything because it was gone, done, dead, had no value. And it was like, holy shit, like value just got wiped out in 4 months. Um, like that's where we are right now.
Yeah.
Will this
Yeah.
be the way it is? I don't know. Is it a moment in time? Perhaps.
We've talked about AI in other conversations, and you touched on it today, certainly. And when we think about the creative process, having worked recently for a music company that's working with AI technology, the notion of AI in creative processes is a tricky one. It's fraught with challenges and with a certain amount of controversy, of course. And I understand some of the hand wringing about it for sure. I think largely much of the technology will march forward whether we like it or not, and hopefully we legislate appropriately and constrain where we need to and respect people's rights. From a process perspective, though, I'm curious about where you use it, where you see it going, what's got you most excited. I know for me, being able to draft something, give me 5 headlines in a chat GPT to quickly give me some ideas. to collaborate with, as a collaborative enhancement is much more interesting than push a button, write a song, push a button, draw a picture, push a button, write a press release or write a story. Tell me from your personal experience. So I know you've been uh, looking at a lot of stuff and you've been playing with a lot of things. And in the notion of the creative process and the constraints and timelines and things like that, I'm curious as to how you see AI. And I know when I say AI, it's a really broad category, but
Uh,
how do you see tools fitting into this process for better or worse?
you know, I use it in a couple ways. Right now, I would say I subscribe to ChatGPT, Perplexity, Midjourney, and then I have a relationship with this RAG engine that I use for my mosaics.
Mhm.
And I think it's really powerful for cold starts where, you're staring at a blank screen, um,
Sure.
and you need to start. I use it in that way. Um, and then I use it in an editing context. And I'm starting to use it more and more as a thought leader or a thought partner where, I go at it with my head's here. I see this opening. I see this trend. What if, can you create, 4 scenarios for me or something, right? So I'm using it a lot more as a thought partner. Um, and then even like in specific narrative, more for, I use it both corporate and executive, but on the executive front, um, I'm very curious to understand what your prevailing narrative is out there, kind of to the example we talked about earlier, because
Sure.
that's where it starts. That's what people say about you when you're not in the room. Um, or, the thing you had to do, like interview this guy, like figure this guy out. So we want to bring him in or not. Mm. So I'm using it to create benchmarks and starting points. And then I just continue to experiment with like, what else can this do, And I'll go
Right.
random and it'll be like, shit, I didn't know it could do that. Right. And then, but you don't even know to think that. Like, so
Yeah, you have to sort of jump in to find out. Yeah.
yeah, I'm almost having to like unlearn how um to use these tools uh in a different way that is now possible that was never possible. And so I think that's kind of the excitement and the uncertainty of it is the power of it. And you don't even know how to optimize it or ask the right question or uh, think in a way that um, allows it to deconstruct and pull from wisdom that you could never know
Right.
um, in in a new way. Um,
Yeah, the
so
art is becoming more about learning how to write really good prompts and to,
yeah,
you know, continue to refine them and make that go. You alluded to earlier the fact that we both have sons who are on the spectrum. And my son, I know, would not mind me talking about this. He's a musician, a drummer, and really into it. And I think pretty talented. Love for him to focus more if he's listening to this, practice more, focus more. But he's great. And today's National Drummers Day, in fact. So
oh wow, all right,
I celebrate him and myself secondarily in that way. Um, so we have these strong connections to a couple of amazing neurodivergent people, and you have some professional connections to neurodivergent people, and it certainly was a topic that we bonded over. And over the years, my son being diagnosed and learning more about him and revisiting my own history, I've come to uh, believe, while undiagnosed, that I probably fit somewhere on the spectrum or am neurodiverse in some way. And so that part of it was a discovery through awareness, right? You learn what neurodiversity is, and suddenly you start to become more conscious of these things in yourself and in other people. So certainly awareness is increasing out there. What about acceptance? Is it increasing? Should we be thinking more about it in business and the value of that, of neurodiversity?
Um, yeah, really good questions. Um, Acceptance has always been uh, a very the word that comes to mind is elusive, or
Mm.
it's interesting, when we are with Spencer and you just observe other people around him, the comfort factor versus the not comfortable factor
Oh
versus
yeah.
I don't know what to do with this factor. Um, he is acutely aware, or attuned, I should say, to people who are accepting of him.
Hmm.
Like, he'll turn up his ham dial, when there's comfort, right?
Right.
And we have friends in our circles who are pro Spencer, and he's family. And then we've got people that, you know, for lack of better words, tolerate Spencer. Um, and he knows, like, it's a vibe thing, and then we know because it's a vibe thing, right?
Right.
So um, that that's just an interesting people dynamics thing that if I have an answer for it other than acutely aware and observant of it.
Sure.
And then, so my work with Mario, um, you know, I took him on as an executive sprint uh, guy,
Hmm.
who reached out to me and, kind of told me his story that he was, diagnosed as Asperger, just found out he was like 48 at the time, and didn't know. Like, he was dating, he had gotten divorced. He had two kids that were, I think, in their mid 20s now. And he didn't know. He just thought he was a narcissist, or, quirky or whatever. And he was dating this gal who was a psychiatrist. And she's like, you should read this. And he read it and he's like, holy shit, that's me. And then it went on that he got diagnosed with ADHD, but he also has like 142 IQ. So,
Mm.
he's on the Mensa scale, right?
Sure.
And so I took him on, not knowing if what I did would work. And I have 8 sessions, and it's usually an ebb and flow of, people inflow, or it's messy. And sometimes we have to go back to chiropractor and fix stuff. And
Hmm.
it's not a linear thing, right?
Understood.
And by the second session, Mario was like off and running like a comet. And I was like, holy shit, I'm trying to hold on. Um, and it was like, wow, okay. And then that really like unlocked him. And I thought, wow, like, can I do this for more people in this population, you know?
Right.
And so Mario, to his credit, created a newsletter called The Asperger Language. I actually had him create, and this was controversial in circles, I had him create a disclaimer to put on his resume and to put on his LinkedIn, and to basically say, I am Mario, I am Asperger, and I sometimes, misinterpret things. And I thought, I think it would be really cool to have a disclaimer, because it's like, oh, okay, now I get some of the quirkiness, right?
Talked about.
Yeah. And so, I've got academics, and they're, the people that are all in this, they're like, that's disgusting. Actually, no, it's not, you know, to be debated. So Mario has created this concept called neuro universal language, null. It's kind of a double entendre on null. If you're a techie,
I get
null
it.
means zero, right? And it's like, well, it's perfect because it's like 0 to 1. We're trying to get this population from a 0 to 1 place. And so um, the idea behind neuro universal language is basically to be kind of a translation layer between neurodiverse people and neurotypical people.
Mm.
And so in Mario's case, and again, the spectrum is a continuum. So it is a spectrum for a reason, because it's not linear. Um, but in Mario's case, like, he can't read body language. He can't read facial expressions.
Sure.
So if you were laughing, he would get offended and start to get more loud and maybe more belligerent, and,
Right.
and, but that was because he didn't know you were laughing because he was funny. Right. So it just wasn't there. So the first thing that we're going to create, we got these glasses from Brilliant Labs out of Singapore. It's kind of a 10-year later open source version of Google Glasses.
Hmm.
So with Brilliant Labs, we can stitch stuff into the glasses, and we're partnering with this company called Wellbeing.ai out of Netherlands. Wellbeing.ai has, I believe, up to like 42 emojis of your well-being, happy, sad, angry, frustrated, whatever. And they
Right.
primarily are used at work to like, what's your temperature? How are you feeling? So it's more of a communication, well-being play in companies.
Got it.
So we're going to take, I think 6 emojis, and we're going to adapt them and adopt them to the glasses so that a neurotypical person can understand what the neurodiverse person can understand what the neurotypical person is, how they're responding. And then we have a notion of a battery, like on your phone, like, it's time to charge your phone, your battery's draining, right? So we're stitching the concept of that into this as well, about like, okay, Mario, your battery is down to low depletion. Like, you need to take a time out and go chill, right? Because
Yeah.
as you know, our
You're getting
guys need
overstimulated now
they
and not respond well or
yeah,
whatever.
they
Yeah.
they they need a timeout zone, right? Or go to a comfort
Some
place.
do. Some do.
Some so we're dabbling with that, and then right now we're like trying to raise money or get a grant. Um, and Microsoft has provided us with compute time, so we have some Microsoft uh, things going on. Mario has just signed up and got accepted into an accelerator in Belgium, I want to say. So little by little, this is starting to become a reality. And then, I'm kind of the US link to this.
Right.
And I just got introduced to this group called Autism Angels, who fund and invest in things like this. So I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we package this? And one of the concepts that I'm playing with, and in fact, I just got the artwork today. We have this really cool null design by Mario's, one of his sons is kind of a graphic artist guy.
Hmm.
And then we have 2 billion, because there are 2 billion people on the spectrum in the world. So it's 15 to 20%. The population is somewhere on the neurodiverse spectrum.
Right.
So we're taking, big 2.0 B and then null and big bold letters. And I'm going to turn it into merch, like hats, hoodies, whatever, and
Cool.
then try to think if we can use that as a way to fundraise.
That's
Put
interesting.
merch out there, and kind of Bombas meets Tom's Itch, but like in reverse, and then figure out, can we make this into a social impact kind of component to what we're building?
Mm.
So again, like innovating with business models, um, innovating with things that can, help bring awareness to this population, um, and try to get this thing built so we can make it affordable
Yeah.
for, 10% of the world to maybe, be included. Because I
Yeah.
think with the VR and the headwear stuff, there's a nose. I want to make null inclusive. So we pull these brains into the workplace. Those were your original question. Versus giving them goggles and putting them in the back room in isolation, because
Sure.
they already suffer from isolation.
Yeah, that's
So
for sure.
can we pull them forward into the mainstream uh, via this, AI and the translation layer that's possible today?
Right. That's interesting. I think one of the challenges always when you're talking about spectrum or neurodivergence is how uh, variable it is in
Oh
terms
my
of how
God.
people are. So I'll make the leap and assume that although undiagnosed, that I am neurodiverse in some fashion. I'd like to believe that it's not only been a challenge, because it certainly has been a challenge for me historically, and particularly in academics and otherwise, but beyond that, I think it's also been a strength. And I would love for businesses to see it as a strength also.
Yeah, it's a
When you think about
superpower.
diversity in the population. So certainly already people realize, oh, okay, this guy is autistic, but he's a brilliant coder. Stick him in the back room, let him code all day, uh, dim the lights, take the fluorescence out, whatever accommodations he needs, and we will take advantage of that sort of very identifiable
Yep.
skill and value.
Yep.
On the other hand, as I described myself, and even my son, my son is kind of under the radar a little bit because he doesn't have stems that people can see. He's learned to either mask them, which I sometimes regret because there's probably pressure to do that early in his life.
Yep.
And I hate to think of what sort of stress that puts him under, or what at one time the stress that it caused him. But a lot of people meet him and say, "Oh, I would never know that he was autistic." And I think he's proudly autistic, and he would never change a thing about himself. And I realize that other people struggle much more, or they are in a very, very different place. So you can't conflate everybody's situation,
Absolutely.
or overgeneralize.
Yep.
But I would like to think, you still see it. There are certainly programs for recruiting at certain big companies into those specific roles that I mentioned, like coding or math or whatever, because they want to take advantage of these special skill sets. On the other hand, I would like everybody to be in a place where they feel comfortable disclosing if they want to, and for it to be okay.
Yes.
And that's where I think we will have reached a certain place where somebody might realize, okay, this person's odd and can't look me in the eye and might not be great greeting clients in a sales meeting, but they're really great on the team when it comes to executing the project and brainstorming or whatever it might be. And even then, hopefully the client isn't freaked out by the guy who can't shake their hand and look them in the eye or whatever.
Right.
Hopefully we get to that place.
Yeah, because
And
Mario.
I hope that it will happen, over time. I think that on the one hand, disclosure is a very personal thing. As somebody who is relatively successful, I've raised a family, earned a good living, I have a career, those types of things, I've done fine. I almost feel like I have a moral imperative to disclose, and maybe not up front and maybe not in real time, but maybe in retrospect. I increasingly feel that if I were more out about my suspicions, and again, I don't want to overstate it because I haven't been diagnosed, but I have a high level of confidence in where I sit. That maybe others would be more understanding and maybe, more, not just understanding and embracing and accepting, but actually embracing. Because there are a lot of people who thought I've added a lot of value at a company. They've probably also been frustrated by some of my other traits, admittedly. And I imagine that there are lots of people out there like me, and who are either ADHD or autistic or any number of other neurodivergent traits, and have managed to be successful and have never disclosed either a diagnosis or a suspicion.
Yeah, or didn't know, right? Like, because in our generation, that wasn't really as pronounced as it was for us as the parent with our kids.
Right. Yeah. So I'm hoping that things will continue to progress. It's going to take time, because I think that clearly diversity in the workspace is really easy to virtue signal about. I'm not talking about let's do a video and put it on LinkedIn and have our HR team flog the fact that we're so great about blah, 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 and we don't need that. But I think there are probably ways that those of us who are either neurodivergent or neurodivergent cousins or friendly to, et cetera, could do more in the workplace to help really value that, the neurodiverse individual, but also their effect on an organization, which I have to believe is ultimately a net positive.
Yeah, I think going forward, because Mario lives in 2080 and can't understand why we just don't zoom there and then work backwards, right?
Right.
We won't get there incrementally. We'll only get there if we work backwards and then figure it out, right? And so he even just has a different perspective, right? And when I look at his brain, and I've, engaged with him, you know, he is AI. And I do kind of feel like these brains are very kin or close to AI because it's very pattern recognition, the way they meticulate their thinking. And I'm almost like, gosh, these superpowers are going to be the kind of people that I think will give companies strategic advantages. Um,
I agree.
if if they make room, you know.
If they make room. Yeah. And sadly, whether it's the economy or shift in the climate, and I mean the sort of political and social climate, um, it seems sad to me that we seem like we took some steps forward on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I like the broader definition of diversity beyond race and gender and
Correct.
sexual preference and things like that. And I I hope that we'll continue to march forward. It seems like there were a few steps forward and one or two back. Hopefully that will get better in the near future. But I'm hopeful that awareness leads to some sort of embrace and some recognition of value moving forward. I think it's got to happen one way or the other. Hopefully in a positive way.
Yeah. And, as I, age wise, it's like, okay, what's my legacy going to be? Right.
Mm,
Am I all in on this and this is my thing? Or is this one of the things? Cause I feel like I'm landing in this like soupy area of human connection meets human capital.
right.
In a company who kind of owns that. Is that the CHRO, the CEO? Yes and yes, but not
Yeah.
really. Even when you think about brand, like corporate brand, CMO, employee brand, employer brand, usually falls under HR, and then they don't talk to each other. So you got like a disconnect on the brand.
Right.
And it's just like,
Too often, you're right.
and I'm living in the cracks of all that, right? Because I've worked on a lot of future of work stuff. In fact, I'm working with a AI led executive recruiting company right now. This is his third company, and it's taking on a 50-year-old way we do things. And because he's, Indian background, he was leaning heavy into DEI, removing bias by masking and almost creating like a Bumble like for hiring.
Got it.
I like
That's
you,
an
you like
interesting thing.
me. Okay, let's like now we can reveal more, right? So he's built an algorithm based on accomplishments versus skills, or bullet points. It gets a little deeper. So it's definitely kind of a different way to look at someone because I can remove your name, you can remove your education, you can remove a lot of
Mm,
stuff and just focus on I've done this. Um, so that's been fun just to, kind of dig in. Um, again, like, breaking the status quo.
right.
I have fun with those because it's like,
I understand that. I would venture, it's not a guess, but I would venture to say that you are inclined towards doing multiple things at the same time because your history certainly supports that and your present supports that. And you could dive down, down to a single pursuit or, a single project. But I suspect that you benefit from the broad focus of the various things that you do, and you would perhaps be doing a disservice ultimately to any of the individual projects that you're doing by zooming in even on that same one. It wouldn't necessarily be good for it. Um,
yeah,
just my
that's
opinion.
therein is the gift and the curse, right? Because even if I, like the last real job I had was the connected car space, and
Hmm.
we were designing something that had never been done before. And, you know, we got it, it got adoption. We got acquired by Harman, and but it forced me to be, very vertical in my thinking. But even when I get vertical, I don't, because like then I, start connecting dots that way.
Right.
That is a little different. But yeah, if I were to be put in a box and told to focus on, you know, building the box, I would immediately probably get outside the box.
Nobody puts Tobin in a box.
Yeah, I think I'm hopeless. I don't think I'm hireable at this point.
That's good stuff. All right. I've used far too much of your time, and it's been
Fun.
an absolute thank you for taking the time to do this. I need a clever sign off. I'll have to come up with something. I have nothing clever other than to say that I'm smarter again for having spoken with you. So thank you very much. Tobin, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me.